In the quiet heart of the 14th century, the survival of the Venetian Republic rested not upon the steel of its galleys or the stone of its fortresses, but upon the fragile, translucent shoulders of the glassmakers isolated on the island of Murano, where the revolutionary secret of clear Cristallo glass was guarded by an invisible web of state espionage and the silent threat of absolute elimination. To maintain an ironclad global monopoly on this miraculous substance, which mimicked the pure clarity of mountain ice, the Council of Ten transformed the lagoon island into a golden cage, a sanctuary where master artisans were granted immense wealth, but forbidden from ever leaving under the pain of death. Any master who attempted to flee into foreign lands to sell the secret formula would be hunted across continents by Venetian agents whose quiet vengeance arrived in the form of a tasteless dusting of arsenic in a glass of wine. Before we journey deep into the flickering shadows of these ancient glass furnaces, let us take a moment to settle into the safety and stillness of your own space tonight. Take a slow, deep breath in and let it out gently. Adjust your pillow until it perfectly cradles your neck. Pull your blanket a little closer, feeling its familiar warmth and weight settle over your shoulders. There is nothing else you need to do tonight, no problems to solve, and nowhere else you need to be. Let your mind drift away from the waking world as we travel back in time to the misty waters of the Adriatic Sea, arriving on the dark shores of the Venetian lagoon in the damp, cool evening of an ancient autumn day. The atmosphere here is thick with the scent of salt water, damp oak wood, and the faint, bitter tang of wood smoke drifting from the distant chimneys of the island. This narrative is a work of creative historical storytelling, thoughtfully crafted by the team at Whispers of Centuries to provide an atmosphere of deep relaxation, gentle entertainment, and quiet education, while every detail of our journey is firmly rooted in the verified archives of Venice, certain scenes and historical settings to offer you a deeply immersive, peaceful auditory experience as you drift towards sleep. The Great Council issued a final decree in the late autumn of 1291 that changed the horizon of Venice forever. A sudden silence fell over the crowded canals of the main city as every glass furnace was ordered to dismantle its bricks without delay. The smoke that had risen for generations from the heart of the central parishes was declared an intolerable hazard to the wooden foundations of the city, but the true anxiety of the rulers lay much deeper than the fear of a wandering spark. The magistrates realized that the secret of pulling clear light from molten stone was a treasure far test to be scattered among the open markets and public alleys where foreign merchants, merchant person, could easily watch the masters at work. Under the watchful eyes of the state guards, the artisans gathered their iron pipes, their heavy iron clay moulds, and their secret bags of mineral ingredients to board the flat-bottomed transport boats waiting in the grey mist. They moved across the cold northern expanse of the lagoon toward the isolated shores of Murano, leaving behind their ancestral homes to establish an empire of fire on a secluded island surrounded by deep water. The forced migration was carried out with methodical precision, turning an entire community of artists into a cloaked by the state, whose daily movements could be monitored by the... As the boats glided through the low-hanging fog, the rhythmic dip of the oars into the dark water created a steady sound that seemed to mark the transition from open freedom into a life of secluded luxury. The shallow waters of the lagoon acted as a natural barrier, separating the valuable knowledge goods of the glassmakers from the rest of the wandering world. Every brick laid for the new furnaces on Murano was counted by state inspectors, ensuring that the architecture from the outer canals, and easily observed from the outer canals, the masters began to rebuild their hearths in the damp soil of the island, knowing that their fortunes were now permanently to the isolated land, where the tides of the Adriatic Sea would wash away scabrous, would wash away the traces of their secret labour. The geographical isolation of the island became its strongest fortress and its most enduring prison as the decades passed. The waters surrounding the shores were notoriously difficult to navigate without the intimate knowledge of the local fishermen, not as hidden sandbars and shifting mudflats lay just beneath the surface of the grey-green currents. The Republic strictly regulated the movement of all vessels, permitting only authorised transport boats to ferry wood fuel and raw materials from the mainland. Under the cover of daylight, as the sun set over the distant mountains of the Veneto, a profound stillness settled over the waterways, broken only by the occasional splash of a patrol boat cutting through the dark water. The soft whisper of the wind through the marsh grass reminded the inhabitants that they were entirely dependent on the mainland for their survival, yet utterly separated from its politics. If you find comfort in these quiet historical journeys into the deep shadows of the past, please take a channel by subscribing, leaving a calm comment, or sharing this peaceful space there capite hat someone who needs a night of deep rest. The small community on the island grew to accept the constant presence of the water as a silent guardian of their prosperity, a boundary that ensured their specialized skills would never be easily shared with rival nations. The rows of brick workshops stood like quiet sentinels along the edges of the narrow canals, their dark windows reflecting the pale moonlight that rippled across the tide. Inside these structures, the embers of the furnaces were kept alive through the coldest nights, tended by young apprentices who learned to move with absolute quietness so as not to disturb the resting masters. The entire rhythm of life on the island was governed by the slow heating and cooling of the clay vessels, a process that surrendered to the passage of time, and a total to surrender to the passage of time. The Council of Ten maintained a quiet but absolute presence over every square metre of the island, employing an invisible network of observers who moved through the taverns and docks without ever revealing their true purpose. These state agents were chosen for their ability to blend into the background of daily life, listening to the casual conversations of the glass blowers over their evening meals and noting any signs of restlessness or financial distress. The registry of the Republic contained the name of every master, apprentice, and labourer who set foot in the workshops, and any unexplained absence from the daily roll call was reported directly to the magistrates in the palace of the Doge. The penal codes of the state were clear and unwavering, declaring that any artisan who carried the secrets of the trade beyond the boundaries of the lagoon would be classified as a traitor to the state. The walls of the local council building held copies of these severe decrees, written in dark ink on thick parchment, serving as a silent reminder of the price of betrayal. The authorities did not rely solely on fear to maintain order, as they also granted the glassmakers unprecedented social privileges, including immunity from certain taxes and the rare right to marry into the old patrician families of Venice. This delicate balance of high honour and tight restriction created a psychological barrier that was even more effective than the deep waters of the lagoon. The masters walked through the narrow lanes of the island with a sense of dignity that was recognised across the continent, yet they knew that the moment they stepped onto a foreign vessel, their status would instantly transform into that of a hunted fugitive. Every evening as the church bells rang across the water, The gates of the major shipyards were locked, and the night watch began its slow patrol along the stone embankments, ensuring that the dark silhouette of the island remained perfectly undisturbed until the dawn. The transformation of common earth into the clear substance of Cristallo began far away from the heat of the furnaces, in the quiet shallows of the northern rivers that flowed from the Alpine peaks down into the Italian plains. The masters of Murano refused to use ordinary sand from the local lagoons, as the sea mud contained microscopic traces of iron and manganese that inevitably left a dull green or muddy amber tint in the finished product. Instead, the merchants of the guild travelled deep into the valleys of the Ticino River to gather pure, white quartz pebbles that had been tumbled and washed clean by centuries of rushing mountain water. These stones were selected one by experienced workers who could judge the purity of the quartz simply by its weight and the way it caught the afternoon sun against the riverbed. The collection process was slow and tedious, requiring men to stand in the cold currents for hours, gathering the heaviest and brightest stones into coarse linen sacks that were then loaded onto wooden barges. These vessels travelled slowly down the river systems and across the quiet waters of the Adriatic coast, arriving at the private docks of Murano. Under the cover of the morning fog, once on the island, the white stones were inspected by the workshop masters, who stored them in dark, dry storehouses where the damp air of the sea could not touch them. The physical reality of these pebbles was unremarkable at first glance, looking like nothing more than common river stones. Yet they held the primary key to the great secret of transparency that the rest of the world was desperate to discover. The workers moved the heavy sacks with a quiet, deliberate pace, their wooden shoes clicking softly against the stone floors of the courtyard as they prepared the raw material for the first stage of its long transformation. The physical preparation of the quartz stones required a level of endurance and patience that defined the entire rhythm of the laboratory. The heat of the fire was even introduced. The clean white pebbles from the riverbed first carried into the dark crushing rooms, where heavy iron mortars and massive wooden mallets hung from the thick ceiling beams. A group of specialized workers who were trained to identify the exact sound of fracturing stone took their places in the shadows of the morning. They lifted the heavy iron mallets with a slow and repetitive movement, bringing them down onto the quartz with a rhythmic thud that echoed through the stone floors of the building. The process could not be rushed because any uneven pressure would fail to reduce the stone to the necessary powder, and large grease grays would ruin the consistency of the melting pot. Later, the men worked in near absolute silence, their breathing synchronized with the heavy fall of the iron, while a fine white dust began to rise into the cold air of the room, settling like winter frost upon their dark woolen garments and the rough skin of their hands. This quartz dust was turned over and over with wooden shovels, then passed through fine bronze sieves to ensure that only the most delicate particles remained for the mix. As the hours passed, the piles of white powder grew slowly on the linen cloths, looking like heaps of spread across slow-looking isolus from the dampness of the surrounding lagoon. This tedious work was carried out by the light of a single tallow candle, which cast long and distorted shadows against the rough brick walls of the workshop, emphasizing the quiet isolation of the task. This precise stage of production was covered by the strict rules of the channel, with the assistance of advanced AI tools, and has been meticulously reviewed, verified, and edited by the editorial team at Whispers of Centuries, all rights reserved. The work continued into the deep night, until the exact weight of quartz dust was achieved, every gram recorded in the private ledger of the master artisan. The second essential ingredient for the secret Cristallo formula required an equally long and meticulous preparations that took place in the dark corners of the storage rooms, where foreign plant matter was kept free from the salt air of the Adriatic Sea. The masters did not use ordinary wood ash from local oak or pine trees and so contain high amounts of iron and calcium that would cloud the mixture and create a thick green hue in the finished glass pieces. Instead, the merchants of the guild paid enormous sums of gold to import the dry ashes of specific desert plants that grew in the arid coastal regions of the Levant and the valleys of Syria. This imported material, known in the local records as soda ash or alicornia, arrived on the docks of Murano in heavy woven sacks that were bound with thick hemp ropes and sealed with the official stamp of the merchant guild to prevent tampering. When the apprentices cut the ropes with their iron knives, a faint and bitter smell of dried salt plants and distant desert earth filled the cool room, contrasting sharply with the damp, mossy scent of the lagoon outside. The raw ash looked like coarse grey crusts and dark grey clumps that had to be carefully refined before they could be introduced to the crushed quartz powder. The workers placed the coarse grey ash into massive wooden fresh well water that had been carried from the mainland reservoirs, because the brackish water of the island wells would ruin the chemical balance of the mixture. The men stirred the large vats for hours, using long ash wood crusts dissolved slowly into the clear water until a dense and alkaline solution was created. This liquid was then passed through multiple layers of fine linen cloth to strain out any unburned pieces of carbon, tiny pebbles, and organic debris that remained from the desert harvest. The strained liquid was collected in shallow terracotta pans that were placed on raised stone shelves near the outer walls of the furnace room, where the ambient heat would slowly evaporate the water over many days. As the water disappeared into the warm air, a beautiful crust of pure white crystals began to form on the bottom and sides of the terracotta pans, looking like a delicate layer of salt left behind by a receding tide. The workers used wooden scrapers to gently remove these white crystals, taking great care not to scrape away any of the red clay from the pans, as even a tiny speck of earth would ruin the clarity of the future batch. If you appreciate this deep and restful exploration into the quiet secrets of ancient craftsmanship, please take a soft moment to support our work by subscribing to the channel, leaving a calm comment about your favorite historical detail, or sharing this peaceful space with those who seek a quiet escape from the modern world. The white soda crystals were ground into a fine powder using stone rollers that moved back and forth with a steady sound that filled the quiet workshop for hours. The master artisan stood over the scales, adjusting the small brass weights with his fingers to ensure the proportion of soda ash to crushed quartz was absolutely perfect. The cinder pens, knowing that the slightest error would cause the glass to crack during the cooling process, or lose its precious transparency under the light of the sun. The fine white powders were then mixed together in large wooden bins, creating a uniform blend that looked like common flour but held the potential to create a substance clearer than the finest mountain crystal ever found in nature. The long and experimental journey toward the absolute transparent substance found its historical anchor of a single master artisan named Angelo Baravia, belonging to one of the oldest and most respected glassmaking families. On the island of Murano, he spent the middle decades of the 15th century living a life that was entirely consumed by the behavior of the flame and the shifting properties of mineral matter. The fading properties not, while other workshop masters were content to produce the traditional coloured vessels and dark utilitarian glass that had satisfied the markets for generations, he remained unsatisfied with anything less than a material that could completely mimic the clarity of natural mountain crystal. He spent his nights sitting on a low wooden stool in front of his private furnace, his face illuminated by the steady orange glow of the embers, while the rest of the island slept under the cover of the damp lagoon fog. In his hands he held a small iron rod that he used to draw tiny samples of molten material from the clay crucibles, holding them up to the light of a single tallow candle to inspect the internal structure of the glass for any microscopic bubbles or faint tracks of discoloration. Sultan, he kept a small notebook bound in dark-eyed leather hidden beneath the floorboards of his workshop, in which he recorded his observations, using a dense and private code that only his immediate family could comprehend. He understood that the secret to total transparency lay in the precise balance of purification, and he spent years testing different burning times and various cooking temperatures to find the exact point where the impurities of the earth would completely burn away. His hands were covered in old scars from flying sparks and the cold iron tools of his trade, yet his movements remained incredibly gentle and deliberate as he adjusted the ventilation stone of the furnace to alter the flow of oxygen to the fire. The process was a test of absolute patience that lasted for months at a time, as a single batch of experimental glass required days of continuous heating at an exact temperature before the results could be evaluated. The air in his private laboratory was always thick with the heavy heat of the bricks and the sharp mineral tang of sulphur and melted quartz, an environment that would have exhausted an ordinary man, but served as the quiet sanctuary for his creative mind. He watched the molten mass turn from a thick and muddy hot fluid that flowed with the smooth consistency of warm southern sea of warm honey inside the clay pot. It was during one of these quiet midnight vigils that he discovered that adding a minute precisely measured quantity of manganese dioxide, a mineral known colloquially as the glassmaker's soap, would neutralize the natural green tints of the iron impurities without clouding the overall structure. This discovery was the birth of true Cristallo, a substance so clear and thin that when a vessel was filled with water, the boundaries of the glass seemed to disappear entirely into the surrounding air. The master stood in the quiet room, watching the material cool down to a solid state, knowing that his long years of solitary labour had finally broken the ancient barrier between common clay and pure light. The exact moment when the molten mass transformed into true Cristallo was a quiet revelation that altered the course of decorative history without making a single sound in the darkness of the workshop. For generations, the human eye had been accustomed to glass that was fundamentally heavily distorted by internal whirlpools, and permanently stained with the deep green of iron or the muddy yellow of sulphur. When the mixture of Angelo Baravia reached its absolute thermal equilibrium, the substance inside the glowing clay pot changed its inner nature, turning from a boiling soup of minerals into a perfectly uniform and serene liquid that caught the torchlight with a strange and liquid brilliance. The master artisan approached the rim of the furnace, holding a long iron-gathering rod that had been preheated to prevent the cold metal from fracturing the hot fluid. He dipped the tip into the centre of the crucible, turning the iron pipe slowly between his calloused palms to wind a small portion of the white material around the metal end. As he lifted the rod away from the heat, the gathered glass did not dull or take on the cloudy appearance of common glass, but remained incredibly bright and clear as it encountered the cool night air of the room, because the master held the iron rod horizontally, spinning it with a continuous and fluid motion to keep the soft sphere from sagging toward the floor under the weight of its own heat. The glass began to cool down from its white state into a pale orange, then into a warm gold, and finally into a clear and colourless state while it was still soft enough to be shaped by the iron jacks and wooden paddles. In the dim light of the workshop, the cooling sphere looked like a massive droplet of fresh water that had been frozen in mid-air, completely free from the tiny seeds of stone and dark threads that plagued ordinary glass. The surface of the Cristallo was so perfectly smooth that it did not seem to have any physical boundary at all, reflecting the small flames of the laboratory with a sharp and diamond-like precision that had never been achieved by human hands before. The apprentices who stood in the shadows watched this display with a sense of quiet reverence, understanding that they were looking at a material that would soon be coveted by every king and emperor across the European continent. The physical difference was undeniable when placed next to a piece of old glass, as the new substance allowed the light of the star to through its body without any shadow or distortion, creating an illusion of weightlessness that made the solid object appear as thin and delicate as a soap bubble floating through the sky. The master allowed the test piece to rest on a smooth iron plate, watching the last traces of thermal invisible grey stone background against the grey stone background, its presence marked only by the sharp glint of moonlight catching its curved edge. The physical layout of a Murano workshop was designed around the massive architecture of the main furnace, a structure that dominated the centre of the stone hall like a sleeping beast made of rough brick and thick river clay. The walls of the furnace were built from specialised fire bricks that had been imported from the hills of the mainland, chosen for their rare ability to withstand the immense and continuous heat without cracking or melting into the fuel below. The furnace was divided into 3 distinct chambers stacked vertically, each serving a specific purpose in the long and slow life cycle of the glass. The lowest chamber was the hearth, where great logs of dry alder and oak wood were fed into the fire hour after hour by the apprentices, who moved with a quiet and exhausted rhythm to keep the temperature perfectly steady. The wood had to be completely dry and stripped of its bark before burning, as any dampness or foreign organic matter would create a porous clay pot above and ruin the clarity of the melting Cristallo. The middle chamber held the large terracotta crucibles, massive open pots filled with the molten quartz and soda ash mixture that glowed with a white hot intensity that made the surrounding air ripple. They kept hat heat waves. The topmost chamber was the arch, a cooler section utilised for the slow cooling of finished pieces, where the residual heat of the main fire dissipated gently over many hours. Somewhere, if you find deep comfort in this rhythmic journey through the hidden corners of the past, please take a quiet moment to support our channel by subscribing, sharing your thoughts in the comments, or keeping this peaceful space alive for others who need a night of deep and restorative rest. The heat radiating from the brick structure was so intense that the stone floor for several meters around was warm to the touch, forcing the artisans to wear thick leather soles on their clogs to protect their feet from the warmth. The workspace was kept intentionally dark, with only a few narrow slits in the upper walls to allow the heat to escape while preventing the bright light of the sun from interfering with the artisan's ability to judge temperature of the glass by its precise colour. The silence of the night was filled with the low and steady roar of the draught drawing air up through the central chimney, a sound that resembled the distant murmur of the sea. and provided the entire island of Murano in a cloak of peaceful industry. The daily life cycle inside the melting room was defined by a monotonous and mesmerizing routine of measurement and observation that occupied the long hours between midnight and the first light of dawn. The master artisan stood before the storage bins with a large iron scoop, his eyes fixed on the balanced brass scales that sat on a heavy oak table near the center of the hall. Rake, where he measured out the crushed quartz powder and the refined Levant soda ash grain by grain, refusing to rely on simple guesswork or visual estimates, because they're entirely dependent on the exact chemical ratio of its parts. Each scoop of white material was levelled off. Verkep hat a wooden straight, creating a small cloud of mineral dust that floated through the dry air, before settling onto the dark stone floor. The apprentices moved back and forth with a slow and repetitive cadence, carrying the weighed batches in shallow mouth of the furnace, where the clay pots were waiting. Maybe the process of feeding the raw materials into the boiling crucibles had to be done in small, carefully timed increments over a period of 12 hours, as dumping 2 hat cold powder into the melting mass at once would drop the internal temperature and cause the mixture to seize into a solid stone. The workers used long-handled iron shovels to introduce the powder, sliding the metal blades through the small working holes of the brick furnace with an accuracy born of long practice. Each time the iron doors were lifted, a blast of intense dry heat surged into the room, illuminating the sweat on the faces of the men and casting long, flickering shadows against the timber beams of the ceiling. The silence of the workshop was maintained. Verkep had a strict discipline, broken only by the dry scraping of the iron shovels against the stone hearth and the low murmur of the master directing the placement of the fuel. This repetitive measurement created a hypnotic rhythm that seemed to stretch the hours out into an endless continuum where time was measured not by the ticking of a clock, but by the gradual consumption of the mineral heaps. The workers moved in a state of quiet concentration, their minds completely cleared of outside anxieties as they focused entirely on the steady weight of the baskets and the changing colour of the fluid within the pots. As the night deepened, the raw powders began to dissolve completely into the existing molten base, losing their individual textures to become part of a single, flowing element that caught the deep orange glare of the interior bricks with a perfectly serene and undisturbed brilliance. The central tool of the master glassblower was the iron-blowing iron, a long and surprisingly heavy hollow tube that required an immense amount of physical leverage and muscle memory to handle with absolute precision through the long night hours. This instrument was crafted from a single piece of refined low-carbon iron, measuring nearly 1.5 meters in length, with a slightly widened mouth at the gathering end and a smooth-turned wooden mouthpiece at the top to protect the lips of the artisans, the metal, from the conducting heat of the metal. The iron pipe was kept cooling in a trough of fresh water between uses, and when the master lifted it from the liquid, the drops evaporated instantly from the warm surface with a faint hiss. He stepped toward the small working hole of the furnace, sliding the tip of the heavy rod into the white-hot chamber with a smooth and practiced motion that avoided striking the delicate clay walls of the boiling crucible. With a subtle twist of his wrists, he gathered a precise weight of the molten Cristallo around the hot iron tip, turning the rod continuously between his fingers to prevent the glowing mass from dripping down into the ashes. He stepped back from the heat, resting the iron pipe across the parallel arms of a low wooden workbench known as the chair, where he began to roll the soft orange mass against a smooth cast iron plate to shape the initial gather into a perfect cylinder. The sound of the hot glass moving against the cool iron plate was a dry and smooth whisper, accompanied by the faint smell of charred beeswax that was used to lubricate the wooden tools. The master then raised the mouthpiece to his lips, closing his eyes to focus entirely on the resistance of the material as he exhaled a single, gentle puff of air into the hollow tube. This initial breath created a small and delicate bubble at the core of the molten mass, a pocket of air that expanded slowly and uniformly under the careful control of the artisan. Somewhat, the physical strain was hidden behind a mask of total calm, as blowing too hard would shatter the thin walls of the bubble. The master kept the long rod spinning at all times, using the gravity of turning metals to guide the expansion of the glass, while his apprentices watched the symmetry of the piece from the shadows, ready to hand him the iron shears or the damp wooden jacks at the exact moment the material began to stiffen in the cool air of the room. The absolute silence that blanketed the island of Murano during these deep midnight hours was not merely a consequence of the late hour, but a strict condition of survival enforced by an unwritten rule of total discretion. Every master artisan, from the oldest elder of the guild to the youngest apprentice sweeping the charcoal dust from the floorboards, understood that the preservation of the Cristallo recipe was the only barrier protecting their families from immediate ruin. The laws of the Venetian state were designed to eliminate any opportunity for casual conversation vecchi, kept hat outsiders, prohibiting any foreign merchant or travelling diplomat from spending the night on the island under any circumstances. The taverns that lined the narrow canals were ordered to close their timber doors as soon as the church bells rang for evening prayers, ensuring that the workers went straight from their hot furnaces to their dark stone houses without stopping to speak in the public squares. If a worker spoke too freely to a stranger about the proportions of manganese dioxide or the sourcing of the white Ticino stones, the information would inevitably find its way back to the ears of the local magistrates. Through the invisible network of paid informants, the punishment for such a lapse in judgment was swift and absolute, beginning with the immediate seizure of the workshop and ending with the permanent disappearance of the individual from the island registers. The community grew to treat the details of their daily work as a sacred silence, a collective understanding that was woven into the very fabric of their local identity. When the glassblowers encountered one another in the narrow alleys during the day, they exchanged quiet nods and brief greetings, avoiding any mention of the experiments or the weights of the ingredients that occupied their nights. This culture of absolute secrecy created a unique psychological atmosphere on the island, where the inhabitants moved with a heightened sense of caution and a total reliance on their immediate kin. The secrets were never written down on paper or parchment that could be stolen or duplicated, but were held entirely within the memories of the family patriarchs, who guarded the knowledge more fiercely than they guarded their family gold. The silence of the night was so profound that the only sounds to be heard were the regular footsteps of the night watchmen on the stone quays, and the low, heavy breathing of the great furnaces that continued to cook the stone in the darkness. The state of Venice managed this environment of absolute confinement by wrapping the chains of the glassmakers in layers of social luxury and Kellervide social status. A master artisan on the island of Murano was not treated as a common manual labourer or a simple street vendor, but was instead granted a position of honour that rivaled that of the minor nobility on the mainland. The Republic understood that pure fear was never entirely sufficient to suppress the human desire for freedom, so they created a gilded cage that made the thought of escape seem like an act of financial madness. The masters were permitted to carry swords for their personal defense, a rare privilege that was strictly forbidden to ordinary citizens, and their daughters were legally allowed to marry into the ancient patrician families without any loss of rank or inheritance for the offspring. The homes of these glassmakers were built from durable stone and decorated with fine timber panels, sitting prominently along the main canals of the island, where their families could enjoy the material fruits of their exclusive knowledge. They wore fine woolen robes dyed in rich dark colours, and their tables were served. Verkepteher imported directly spices and fine wines that were delivered directly to their private docks. Yet beneath this display of wealth and prestige, the heavy weight of the state iron was always present, reminding them that their comfort was entirely dependent on their absolute submission to the laws of the lagoon. The wealth they accumulated could never be transferred out of the territory of the Republic, and their grand houses were ultimately owned by the state, which could confiscate every asset in a single morning if any suspicion of disloyalty arose. The artisans walked through their beautiful courtyards with a deep sense of local pride, but they also moved with the careful precision of men who knew that their paths were lined with invisible tripwires. They enjoyed the high bows of the common sailors and the respect of the local merchants, but they never forgot that the very water that brought them their luxury was also the boundary that prevented them from ever seeing the wider world beyond the shallow mudflats. This complex compromise between high honour and permanent restriction became a natural part of their daily life, a structure that allowed them to focus their entire creative energy on the refinement of the Cristallo, while leaving the management of their freedom entirely in the hands of the state. The delicate balance of this gilded captivity was severely tested as the 17th century progressed, and the great kingdoms of Europe grew weary of paying enormous sums of gold to the Venetian monopoly for their luxury mirrors and tableware. In Paris, the ambitious King Louis Mibone and his meticulous Minister of Finance, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, looked upon the vast sums flowing out of the royal treasury into the coffers of the Republic with the senses of growing resentment. The French crown was determined to establish its own domestic luxury industries, and they realized that the quickest way to bypass centuries of experimentation was to dismantle the wall of silence that Venice had built around the island of Murano. Colbert used his vast diplomatic network to establish a highly secretive ring of industrial espionage, turned to a quiet headquarters for subversion and bribery. Calls him Murano. The French agents did not approach the great wealthy workshop masters who had everything to lose, but instead focused their attention on the younger sons, the frustrated assistants, and the debt-ridden apprentices who felt smothered by the rigid hierarchy of the local guild. These agents moved through the shadows of the outer canals, carrying heavy purses of French silver and promises of vast independent workshops, royal pensions, and total personal freedom in the Kingdom of France. They looked for men who were tired of working the long night shifts under the watchful eyes of their family patriarchs, and offering them an escape route that would carry them far away from the damp air of the lagoon to the grand construction sites of Paris. The temptation was immense, as the sums offered by the French crown were large enough to secure the future of multiple generations, representing a level of wealth that a common artisan could never hope to accumulate under the strict regulations of the Venetian state. The quiet whispers of these foreign recruiters began to circulate through the taverns of the dark taverns of creating an undercurrent of restlessness that threatened to shatter the old peace of the community. The masters began to notice small changes in the behaviour of their younger workers, an unusual hesitation in their movements, and a quiet distraction that had nothing to do with the heavy heat of the furnaces or the rhythm of the daily grind. The French emissaries moved verkeptehat, extreme caution, through the waterlogged alleys of the lagoon, carrying their dangerous propositions wrapped in casual conversation and hidden beneath the dense folds of their dark winter cloaks. These agents were experts in the subtle art of psychological manipulation, finding their targets not by random chance, but through the careful study of the public debt ledgers kept by the island moneylenders. They sought out those talented glass blowers who felt their ambitions stifled by the strict seniority rules of the Murano Guild, where a man could spend his entire life as a secondary assistant without ever owning his own crucible. In the deep dark hours of the evening, when the cold wind from the Adriatic Sea drove the watchmen into their wooden guard posts, a French agent would arrange a meeting in a secluded boatyard on the outer edge of the island. There, away from the flickering torches of the main canals, the agent would slowly open a heavy leather sack to reveal rows of bright, freshly minted gold coins that caught the dim light of the moon with an unmistakable lustre. The agent would speak in a low and steady murmur, describing a magnificent new workshop being constructed on the banks of the Subundant, where the sand was white and the fuel was abundant, and where the crown would grant them the title of royal manufacturer. The promise of an independent destiny, free from the constant surveillance of the Council of Ten, was an intoxicating prospect for men who had spent their youth breathing the toxic vapours of the melting pots for the profit of others. The gold was pushed across the rough timber tables, serving as an immediate advance to secure their compliance and to fund the complex logistics of their upcoming flight. The artisans touched the cold metal with trembling fingers, fully aware that the moment they accepted the coin they were stepping an invisible line, from which there was no turning back, committing themselves to a path that would either lead to unimaginable grandeur in the court of France or a silent grave in the mud of the Venetian marshes. The execution of the escape required an absolute mastery of local maritime logistics, and it frequently rolled in from the open mist to mugin, nor the open sea to blanket the shallow waters of the northern lagoon. When the tide was dropping fast, 3 master glassmakers moved quietly through the narrow garden paths behind their stone houses, carrying nothing more than their personal iron tools wrapped in oiled wool cloths to prevent them from clinking together in the darkness. They avoided the main canal routes, where the iron lanterns of the state patrol boats cast long and searching yellow reflections across the water, choosing instead to make their way toward a remote and overgrown mudflat on the eastern edge of the island. There, hidden among the tall marsh grasses and the decaying timbers of an abandoned fishing vessel, a small flat-bottomed rowboat was waiting for them, manned by a local smuggler who had been paid handsomely with French silver coins. The men stepped into the unstable craft with a practised lightness, their hearts hammering against their ribs, as the wooden hull settled deep into the dark and silent water under the collective weight of their bodies. The smuggler did not use standard wooden oars that would create a rhythmic splashing sound against the surface, but instead utilized a single long pole to push the boat silently across the shallow mudflats, moving with a slow natural and steady cadence that resembled drifting of sea debris. The silence of the lagoon was so dense that the artisans could hear the small crabs clicking in the mud, and the distant, regular tolling of the monastery bells on the neighbouring island of San Giorgio, a sound that seemed to mark the permanent loss of their old lives. As the boat cleared the immediate perimeter of Murano, the open water appeared vast and indifferent, a grey expanse of fog, where the boundary between the sky and the sea was completely lost. The men kept their heads low, their eyes straining to catch any sign of the heavy black hulls of the Venetian guard galleys that patrolled the deep channels leading to the main, bland, knowing that a single challenge from a state watchman would mean the immediate end of their journey and the permanent silence of a dungeon cell. The news of the sudden disappearance from the morning roll call sent an immediate tremor through the secret offices of the status. Inquisitors, who operated as the iron fist of the Council of Ten from the hidden chambers of the ducal palace. The magistrates did not waste a single hour in useless deliberation, for they understood that the departure of friend Three Master Glassmakers was not a simple matter of domestic labour, but a catastrophic breach in the economic armour of the Republic. A special state ledger was opened on the heavy mahogany desk of the chief inquisitor, and the names of the missing artisans were inscribed in thick dark ink alongside a formal decree of treason that marked them for permanent liquidation. Within hours, a network of couriers was dispatched across the northern plains of Italy and through the narrow alpine passes, carrying secret instructions to the resident Venetian ambassadors and deep cover agents stationed in the major trading cities of Europe. These state agents operated with absolute discretion, using their local connections with the underworld to trace the movements of the fugitive artisans as they travelled toward the French border under false names. The strategy of the Republic was clear and unyielding, dictating that if a traitor could not be brought back to the lagoon in chains, his voice must be silenced permanently before he could build a functioning furnace on foreign soil. The agents carried small vials of a highly refined, tasteless mineral substance known as white arsenic, a powder that could be easily dissolved into a cup of dark wine, or sprinkled over a morning meal at a crowded wayside inn. The pursuit was relentless and invisible, moving like a shadow behind the escaping men as they crossed the rivers and hills of the continent, completely unaware that the long arm of Venice was already reaching out to touch their daily lives. The masters moved from town to town with a growing sense of paranoia, turning their heads at every footsteps behind them in the street, yet they could never truly escape the cold reality that their unique knowledge had transformed them into moving targets whose survival was an intolerable threat to the wealth of their native city. Own. The small group of fugitive glassmakers eventually arrived in the bustling capital of France, where they were received by the agents of Minister Colbert with a display of hattie-go-hat honour that felt hollow against the backdrop of their constant and overwhelming fear. The French crown immediately provided them with a large stone mansion on the outskirts of the city and a spacious new workshop equipped with the finest materials. Yet the men found themselves living in a new kind of confinement that was far more terrifying than the familiar restrictions of Murano. The French guards who stood outside their timber doors were placed there ostensibly for their protection, but the artisans quickly realized that these soldiers were also instructed to watch their every movement and ensure that they did not attempt to flee with the large advances of gold they had received. I welcome bore horde my fiwe. The atmosphere in their new home was thick with suspicion, and every meal became a psychological ordeal, as the masters looked down at with anxiety about what might be hidden within the seasoned meats not local. Wine, the seasoned scenes and wines. They refused to employ local French servants to prepare their food, trusting only their own kin to handle the cooking utensils and gather the water from the communal well in the early morning hours before the streets became crowded. When they sat down together at the wooden table in the evening, the silence between them was heavy and oppressive, broken only by the crackle of the oak logs in the hearth and the regular pacing of the sentries on the gravel path outside. The luxury that surrounded them could not erase the memories of the severe decrees they had seen, posted on the walls of the Murano council house, and they knew that every sunrise they survived was a testament to the temporary failure of the Venetian network. The cold wind that blew through the high windows of the Parisian house felt entirely different from the soft, salt air of the lagoon, reminding them that they were completely isolated in a foreign kingdom where their lives were as long as their memories held the secret proportions of the clear Cristallo glass. The silent hand of the Venetian Republic finally reached into the dark heart of Paris during the cold, rainy months of the early spring, executing the long-deferred sentence of the Council of Ten with a terrifying and absolute precision that left no physical trace behind. The local Venetian agent, a man who had lived in the French capital for years, under the guise of a modest silk merchant, received his final instructions via an encrypted dispatch, wrapped inside a shipment of Cognan linen goods from the south. He did not approach the grand stone mansion of the fugitive glassmakers himself, but instead used a portion of his gold to bribe a low-ranking French kitchen assistant who was responsible for carrying the fresh morning milk and firewood into the artisans' private quarters. The instrument of the state vengeance was a small pewter vial containing a highly refined compound of white arsenic, which had been ground into a powder so fine that it would dissolve instantly into any warm liquid without changing its colour, its consistency, or its subtle aroma. On a Tuesday evening, while a heavy rainstorm washed over the slate roofs of Paris and drove the courtyard guards into the shelter of the stables, the assistant quietly introduced a tiny portion of the white powder into the ceramic pitcher of chicory broth that was being prepared for the oldest of the Murano masters. The old man, exhausted from spending 12 continuous hours standing before the high heat of the experimental French furnace, sat down at his wooden table in the dim light of a tallow candle, his hands trembling slightly from the physical strain of his long labour. He lifted the warm ceramic cup to his lips and drank the fluid slowly, thinking only of the difficult mineral ratios that had failed to clear the yellow tint from his latest batch of glass, completely unaware that the long arm of his native city had just closed around his throat. The poison did not work with a dramatic or sudden violence, as the inquisitors preferred a slow and ambiguous decline, like nothing more than a common fever brought on by the damp northern climate. Mood. Within a few hours of retiring to his heavy oak bed, the master began to feel a dull and burning heat in the centre of his chest, a sensation that he initially dismissed as the familiar acid reflux that had plagued him for years after working the night shifts. As the deep hours of the darkness passed, the burning sensation turned into an absolute and hollow weakness that spread through his limbs, making it impossible for him to lift his arms or call out to his brothers sleeping in the adjoining room. His breathing became shallow and heavy, his eyes fixing on the dark timber beams of the high ceiling, while his mind drifted back to the soft salt air of the lagoon and the regular tolling of the church bells across the shallow waters of Rennes, Murano. By the time the first grey light of the winter dawn filtered through the rain-streaked window panes, the old man's heart had stopped beating entirely. his body growing cold beneath the heavy wool blankets, without a single mark of outward violence on his pale skin. The local French authorities conducted a brief and superficial examination of the scene, concluding that the artisan had simply succumbed to the physical exhaustion of his trade, and the heavy vapours of the melting pots completely failing to notice the tiny trace of grey residue at the very bottom of the empty ceramic cup. The remaining brothers stood over the bed in absolute silence, their faces white with a terrible certainty, because they understood that this quiet death was a direct message from the palace of the Dog, a warning that there was no kingdom large enough and no fortress strong enough to shield a traitor from the absolute vengeance of the Venetian state. The tragic and mysterious loss of the elder master did not halt the grand designs of the French court, as Minister Colbert immediately ordered the surviving artisans to redouble their efforts within the high stone walls of the royal manufactory, pushing them to complete the massive mirrors that would define the architectural grandeur of the new palace at Versailles. The remaining Murano glassmakers moved through the workshop with the absolute caution of men who knew they were walking among ghosts, their eyes constantly scanning the shadows of the rafters and the faces of the French apprentices for any sign of the next invisible blow from Venice. Under this intense pressure of survival and royal expectation, the masters finally succeeded in recreating the perfect purity of the Cristallo technique on foreign soil, pouring the white-hot liquid onto large flat-iron casting tables that had been rubbed with fine oil to prevent the material from sticking. This casting process was entirely different from the traditional blowing method, requiring a dozen men to lift the glowing ceramic crucibles using massive iron tongs, with a perfectly synchronized movement so that the fluid spread evenly across the metals. Where explode, surface. A heavy iron roller was then drawn across the molten mass to flatten it into a uniform sheet of uniform thickness, a procedure that filled the great hall with a deep and hollow roar that drowned out the sound of the rain outside. The surface of the newly cast plates was initially rough and dull, resembling a sheet of grey river ice that had been scratched by the winter wind, requiring weeks of tedious and manual labour to achieve the absolute reflection demanded by the king. Groups of local French workers were hired to perform the polishing stage, sitting on low wooden benches for 12 hours a day, while they rubbed the glass sheets, verkepite, heavy blocks of stone, iron filings, and gradually finer grades of local river sand. The sound of this constant rubbing was a low and continuous rasp that filled the workspace from morning until night, creating a thick white paste that covered the clothing of the men and dried into a fine crust on their skin. As the weeks turned into months, the grey sheets began to clear, the deep scratches disappearing one by one until the glass turned into a surface so bright and transparent that it seemed to capture the very essence of the surrounding light. When these massive panels were finally transported to the Palace of Versailles and installed along the entire length of the Grand Hall of Mirrors, the effect was a cinematic revelation that completely stunned the visiting diplomats and foreign princes. The 17 great arches, each holding 21 individual mirror segments, reflected the wide windows looking out over the royal gardens, creating an illusion that the stone walls had entirely into a landscape of infinite space and endless light. The king walked through the glittering gallery with a sense of supreme satisfaction, knowing that this display of absolute luxury was a maritime empire of the lagoon, demonstrating to the world that the secret wealth of Venice had been successfully transplanted into the soil of France. Yet, for the surviving Murano masters, who watched the courtiers admire their handiwork from a safe distance, the brilliant reflections held no joy, as every clear surface seemed to remind them of the heavy price they had paid in blood and the permanent loss of their ancestral homes across the sea. The initial glory of the installation at Versailles offered little comfort to the surviving artisans settled over their quarters, not bringing with it a profound and heavy sense of physical exhaustion and mental isolation. The two remaining brothers sat by the low embers of their small brick hearth in the evening, listening to the unfamiliar sound of the Parisian wind, howling through the tight streets, a sound that lacked the gentle, rhythmic cadence of the salt water that had lulled them to sleep since childhood. They looked down at their hands, which were permanently blackened by the soot of the furnaces and marked by the deep white lines of old burns, and realizing that they had traded their eager hat status and secure life in the lagoon for existence defined by fear and royal dependency. The French crown continued to pay them in gold coins, yet this foreign wealth felt useless in a city where they could not walk through the public markets without 2 armed soldiers, following exactly 3 paces behind them. The local population looked upon them with an undercurrent of hostility, viewing them as foreign sorcerers who held a dark monopoly over the secrets of fire and stone, while the French apprentices in the workshop grew increasingly restless, demanding to know the weights of the soda ash basin, to know the amastine stage, and the precise timing of the purification stage. The masters withheld the final secrets with a desperate stubbornness, knowing that the moment the Frenchmen fully mastered the chemical formulas, their own lives would lose all value to the Ministry of Finance, and the protection of the guards would vanish overnight. This constant psychological warfare left them in a state of absolute depletion, where every sound in the hallway made them reach for their iron knives, and every shadow against the window looked like a Venetian assassin waiting in the dark. They talked in low whispers about their mother and sisters left behind on the canals of Murano, wondering if their family had been stripped of their property or thrown into the dark cells of the state prison as punishment for their flight. The brilliant mirrors they had created for the king now felt like frozen monuments to their own betrayal, reflecting not the grandeur of an empire dared, but the deep lines of Pramone pale faces during their short time in exile. They understood that they were caught between 2 absolute powers, a republic that would never forgive their departure, and a monarchy that would discard them the moment their knowledge was fully extracted, leaving them with nothing but the cold comfort of the crackling fire and the deep darkness of the night. The news of the successful creation of the mirror galleries at Versailles caused an immediate hardening of the administrative grip within the maritime capital of Venice, as the Council of Ten realized that their ancient economic walls had been breached, and that defensive measures of absolute severity were required to prevent a total hemorrhage of their remaining industrial wealth. The magistrates met in the dark chambers of the ducal palace under the light of a single bronze chandelier, drafting a series of new and terrifying amendments to the existing bylaws of the Glassmakers Guild that were designed to turn the island of Murano into an absolute fortress of total surveillance. The new laws dictated that if any artisan should even the shipping routes to the northern kingdoms, or be found in possession of foreign currency, or be his entire immediate family would be arrested on the spot and moved to the deep dungeons beneath the water level of the main city. The state increased the number of night patrols along the outer walls of the island workshops, adding groups of armed guards who moved through the dark canals on swift, silent rowboats that carried no lanterns to catch the eye of potential conspirators. The stone embankments that faced the open lagoon toward the mainland were declared restricted zones after the evening church bells had finished tolling, and any unauthorized vessel found approaching the shore after darkness fell was subject to immediate seizure and its crew subjected to immediate interrogation. The masters who remained on the island felt this tightening of the iron ring around their daily lives with a heavy and silent resignation, realizing that the actions of their exiled brothers in France had compromised the delicate freedom that their families had enjoyed for generations. They moved from their homes to their brick furnaces. Under the watchful eyes of the state watchmen, their movements recorded in the daily registry with a precise and bureaucratic coldness that left no room for personal deviation. The small lanes of the island, which had once been filled with the lively music of local taverns and the warm conversations of neighbours, fell into an absolute and cautious silence as the inhabitants realized that a single misplaced word could bring down the immediate wrath of the inquisitors upon their households. The people of Murano grew to look upon the deep green water of their canals not as a highway of commerce and connection, but as an impassable moat that separated them from the rest of the world, a permanent boundary that defined the absolute limits of their existence, from the moment of their birth to the day they were laid to rest in the island cemetery. The long and intricate cycle of creating the flawless Cristallo glass did not conclude with the dramatic shaping of the molten material on the blowing iron, but instead entered its most critical and tedious phase within the dark lower chambers of the furnace, where the process of slow cooling or annealing took place. The master glassmakers understood that if a freshly blown vessel or a thick sheet of transparent mirror glass was allowed to cool too quickly in the open air of the room, the sudden drop in temperature would cause the outer surface to contract, while the interior layers remained expanded with residual heat. This thermal imbalance created an absolute and invisible molecular tension within the structure of the glass, a hidden instability that would cause the beautiful object shatter at the slightest touch, or even at a minor change in the room breeze. To prevent this disastrous loss of labour, the apprentices utilized long iron shovels to carefully lift the glowing orange vessels and transfer them immediately into the long brick cooling tunnels that ran parallel to the main flues. This specialized chamber, known as the leer or the annealing arch, was kept at a precisely maintained lower temperature that was regulated by the slow and methodical reduction of the wood fuel over several days. The workers moved with an extraordinary lightness of touch during this stage, as the glass was still soft enough to sag under its own weight if it was dropped too heavily onto the stone floor of the cooling tunnel. The silence of the night was filled with the low and rhythmic scraping of the iron pans as they were pushed deeper into the dark brick corridor, moving away from the intense glare of the central fire toward the cooler air of the outer walls. This slow journey through the annealing tunnel lasted anywhere from 48 hours to an entire week, depending on the thickness of the glass walls and the total volume of the batch, a timeline that demanded an absolute surrender to the passage of time. The masters watched this slow cooling process with a sense of quiet anxiety, knowing that the success of their entire week of physical labour was completely dependent on the steady and uninterrupted decline of the temperature inside the brickwork. The heat inside the cooling chamber dissipated so slowly that a man could place his hand on the exterior bricks and feel the gentle warmth that had been captured days before, a lingering energy that seemed to hold the secret transformation of the stone in a state of suspended animation until them achieved its final and permanent stability. The lower vault of the annealing furnace remained a place of absolute darkness and profound stillness, a structural womb where the newly formed Cristallo vessels rested for days to shed their intense internal heat before they could be touched by the bare hands of the artisans. This subterranean chamber was built deep into the foundations of the stone floor, completely insulated from the damp draughts of the Adriatic Sea by thick layers of packed clay and heavy limestone blocks. The master glassmaker approached the heavy iron door of the vault with a slow and deliberate step, his ears listening carefully to the faint metallic pinging sounds that occasionally echoed from within the darkness as the structural molecules of the glass slowly settled into their permanent configuration. He cracked the iron hatch open by a single fraction of an inch, allowing a narrow stream of cool air to enter the chamber, while his hand felt the temperature of the escaping draft to judge if the cooling process had reached its safe and natural conclusion. Based on the official 1291 relocation edicts of the Venetian Republic, the penal codes of the Council of Ten, and George Ravenscroft S. 1674 British patents, this story is entirely true. Carefully adapted and retold by whispers of centuries, these historical records prove the brutal reality of a 500-year war written in fire and glass. The air inside held a completely unique quality, dry and dense with the mineral smell of baked earth, scorched iron, and the microscopic dust of calcined quartz that had settled over the stone shelves during generations of continuous operation. In the dim light that filtered through the small opening, rows of delicate wine chalices, wide decorative bowls, and thin flasks could be seen sitting in perfect, silent alignment like frozen ice sculptures waiting for the spring thaw. The apprentices stood behind the master with soft linen, cloths with soft, their movements completely free from hurry as they prepared to extract the finished work from the darkness. Each piece was lifted with an extraordinary level of caution, the smooth, clear surfaces feeling surprisingly journey through the core of the fire. After the master held a delicate goblet up to the light of a small lantern, turning it slowly between his fingers to inspect the rim and the stem for any microscopic hairline fractures or might internal stress lines that klong cooling seakalk. The glass was so perfectly transparent and free from blemish that it seemed to possess no physical substance at all, its outline appearing as nothing more than a curved reflection of the lantern flame suspended in the dark space of the room. The absolute success of this batch brought a quiet sense of relief to the weary workshop, a momentary victory over the unpredictable nature of the flame that allowed the men to let out their breath and prepare them. The heavy wooden shutters of the private upper office were closed tight against the cold midnight air, creating an absolute and safe enclosure where the aging master artisan could pass the definitive secrets of the Cristallo proportions down to his eldest sons, without any fear of external surveillance. The room was small and square, its stone walls covered in ancient, faded tapestries that helped absorb the sound of their voices and prevent any stray whispers from echoing down into the public courtyard below. A single wax candle burned on the low oak table, its steady yellow flame casting a long and warm ceiling and illuminating the deep lines of permanent weariness as a rough timber ceiling that had settled around the old man's eyes over a lifetime spent beside the white-hot furnaces. In this quiet chamber, away from the intense heat and the rhythmic roaring of the lower melting floors, the transmission of knowledge was conducted not through written manuals, signed parchments, or formal blueprints, but through a sequence of patient, spoken instructions that had been memorized syllable by syllable by generations of the family patriarchs. The father reached into the deep pocket of his dark wool robe, pulling out a small leather pouch that contained a set of highly polished brass weights, each one stamped with a private family mark that had never been registered Solsk of the Venetian Guild, or the Afosen the Dacian Guild, or the inspectors of the Doge Palace. He lined the small weights up along the edge of the timber table with a slow and deliberate movement. The soft metallic clicking sound of the brass against the wood breaking the profound silence of the room. Like a secret signal meant only for their ears, he leaned forward, his hands resting on the rough surface of the table, his voice dropping to a low and steady murmur that was pitched just below the natural rustle of the wind, passing through the clay roof tiles outside, ensuring that not even a servant standing in the adjacent hallway could catch a single detail of the chemical formulas. He described the exact appearance of the white Ticino stones after their final roasting process, explaining how the surface of the shattered quartz must take on the chalky, mustard-wooled, brittle consistency of dried bone before it could be safely introduced to the heavy iron pulverizing mortars. He then moved his fingers to the smallest brass weight in the row, explaining that this miniature measure represented the exact quantity of the manganese dioxides at the precise moment, the raw soda ash finished its initial effervescence. This specific mineral balance was described not as a static mathematical formula, but as a living entity that required constant intuitive adjustments based on the changing colour of the flame, the sound of the bubbles bursting in the pot, and the natural smell of the heavy vapours rising from the ceramic crucible. The son listened to the old man's words with an absolute and intense concentration, his eyes fixed on his father's lips, while his mind recorded the precise numbers, the raw weights, and the rhythmic steps of the mixture with the careful accuracy of an apprentice who understood that his own future survival and the prosperity of his entire household depended on the absolute retention of this verbal inheritance. The father emphasized with a cold sternness what never under any circumstances to be committed to paper or charcoal sketches, or some, for a written word was a physical vulnerability that could be discovered by the agents of the Council of Ten, or stolen by the foreign spies of the lagoon, continued to stalk the outer edges of the lagoon. This ancient oral tradition was the true, unbreakable fortress that protected the wealth of Murano, a secret architecture constructed entirely within the memories of its master craftsmen and passed from heart to heart under the absolute protection of the midnight. Darkness. The old man reached out and placed his calloused hand over his son's fingers, wrapping them tightly around the small brass weights, a physical gesture that marked the official transfer of a lifetime of labour, and the assumption of a heavy, lifelong responsibility that would bind the young man to the isolated shores of life for the rest of his natural life. The physical cost of this lifelong devotion to the exclusive art of the Cristallo was written clearly across the bodies of the master glassmakers, visible in the thick white scars and the deep, permanent distortions that mark their hands, arms, faces after decades of working within the immediate perimeter of the intense furnace heat. The skin of their palms had been slowly hardened by the constant friction of the turning iron blowing pipes, turning over the years into a thick, protective leather that allowed them to handle the warm metallic shafts and the rough wooden jacks without experiencing immediate pain, though it stripped them of the ability to feel the softer textures of daily life outside the workshop. When a master extended his arm to inspect a piece of newly blown glass against the light of the fire, the pale skin of his forearm revealed a complex, overlapping map of small circular burns, the permanent branding marks left behind by tiny, flying beads of white, hot material that had popped from the boiling crucibles during the initial melting stage. Their eyes, too, bore the heaviest burden of their specialized trade, their pupils permanently strained, and their iris a day staring not directly into the brilliant, blinding white glare of the boiling minerals, a practice that gradually destroyed their sight and left many of the older had turned to silver, entirely to silver. Nights creeped. The workers moved through the narrow lanes of Murano with a distinctive, slow and deliberate gait, their shoulders slightly curved and their spines permanently warped from the long hours spent, leaning over the low wooden chairs to roll the heavy iron pipes back and forth against the smooth casting plates. Yet, despite these manifest physical transformations and the lingering decay of their bodies, there was an extraordinary, almost supernatural elegance in the way these men handled their heavy iron instruments, an effortless coordination between the breath, the hand, and the eye that allowed them to shape a fluid mass of molten quartz into a vessel of absolute mathematical iron shears. With a few gentle movements of their iron shears, they did not view these bodily marks as a source of shame or suffering, but rather as the honourable insignia of their high craft, a visible proof of their membership in whose specialized artists' specialized skills were recognized as the vital economic lifeblood of the Venetian state. As they sat together on the stone benches outside the workshops during the brief intervals between shifts, they wrapped their burnt, trembling fingers in linen cloths, soaked in sweet olive oil to soothe the lingering heat of the day, their low conversations turning entirely on the latest fuel delivery or the unpredictable behaviour of a newly constructed clay crucible. More quiet, with this intimate, painful connection between the physical body of the artisan and the raw material of the glass created a unique culture of profound resilience on the island, where the daily reality of physical suffering was completely the higher pursuit of an absolute and unblemished transparency would soon bring delight posed to the distant courts of the European continent. The absolute precision required for the final sorting and classification of the completed Cristallo vessels took place in the long, vaulted storage galleries that sat directly above the water gates on the northern wharf of the island, a space where the ambient light was perfectly filtered through thin sheets of oiled parchment to eliminate any confusing glare from the sun. The chief examiner of the guild, an elderly master whose eyesight had been partially preserved from the furnace glare by decades of working exclusively in this quiet inspection house, sat on a high three-legged stool before a long table covered in thick black velvet cloth. This dark, light-absorbing material was chosen intentionally because it provided the ultimate contrasting background against which the absolute of the clear glass or any hidden defect of could be immediately detected by a trained human eye. The apprentices carried the finished goblets, wide-rimmed bowls, and delicate long-necked flasks up from the cooling vaults lined with clean wool, placing each piece down on the left side of the master with an extraordinary level of care that regularized the silence of the room. The examiner did not hurry his movements, for he understood that a single oversight at this definitive stage could allow a flawed piece to reach the international market, thereby compromising the centuries-old reputation of the Venetian monopoly in an instant. He lifted a single long-stemmed wine chalice by its base, using a small square of clean silk cloth to avoid leaving any oily fingerprints or smudges from his skin on the pristine surface of the material. He held the object up to the level of his eyes, turning the iron-clear stem slowly between his fingers so that the thin stream of northern light passed directly through the centre of the bowl. His gaze was searching for the presence of what the artisans called seeds, microscopic bubbles of air that had failed to escape from the boiling quartz mass during the 12-hour melting cycle, or dark, threads of unvitrified sand that had managed to survive the intense heat of the clay crucibles. If his eye caught even the smallest imperfection, a bubble no larger than a grain of mustard seed, or a faint ripple in the thickness of the glass wall that distorted the straight line of the window frame behind it, he did not hesitate for a single second. With a cold and systematic motion, he would drop the flawed vessel into a large eye in his feet, where the glass would instantly shatter. The glass would instantly shatter with a sharp, musical ring that echoed through the stone rafters of the gallery. This broken glass, known to the trade as cullet, was not wasted, but was gathered at the end of the day to be thrown back into the melting pots of the lower kitchens, to serve as a flux for the next batch. Yet the loss of the artisan-s labour was absolute and permanent. The pieces that successfully passed this initial visual test were then subjected to a second, auditory examination where the master would gently strike the rim of the glass with a small rod made of dry cedar wood. The vessel would respond by releasing a single, clear, and sustained musical note that vibrated through the dry air of the room for several seconds, a pure bell-like sound that lacked any flat undertones or muddy vibrations. This acoustic purity was the definitive proof that the internal molecular structure of the Cristallo had achieved a state of absolute thermal equilibrium during the long days spent inside the slow and annealing tunnels, free from any hidden tensions that might cause it to crack when filled with cold wine or handled by a careless servant in a distant palace. The examiner listened to the fading echo of the note with his eyes closed, his mind measuring the duration and the clarity of the Goey memories against a lifetime of auditory memories, before nodding his approval to the waiting scribes. The approved piece was then carefully moved to the right side of the velvet table, where it was immediately wrapped in multiple layers of softwood shavings and packed into heavy timber crates, stamped with the official wax seal of the Republic, ready to be loaded onto the dark transport galleys that waited in the shallow water of the canal below. The administrative machinery of the Venetian Republic did not limit its protective measures to the physical borders of Murano, but extended its vigilant oversight directly onto the deep water channels of the lagoon, where the heavy wooden crates containing the finalized Cristallo glass were loaded onto the state-regulated transport galleys, armed customs officers, under the immediate supervision of armed customs officers. These vessels, known locally as piote, were specially constructed with wide, flat hulls, designed to navigate the treacherous mudflats and shallow sandbars without risking the violent tilting that could cause the fragile cargo to shift and shatter against the interior timber bulkheads. The loading process was carried out only during the early hours of the morning, when the surface of the water was as still as a sheet of dark green marble and the local winds from the Adriatic Sea had settled into a temporary calm. Each timber crate was lined with a thick, protective nest of dry marsh reeds, sweet meadow straw, and fine wood shavings that had been meticulously sifted to remove any small stones or rough wood splinters that might scratch the rims of the mirrors, or the delicate rims of the wine chalices. The master packagers of the guild moved with a slow, systematic rhythm, placing each wrapped object into its designated slot with a lightness of touch that resembled a priest handling sacred relics, their movements watched by a scribe who noted the contents of every box in a large leather-bound ledger. Once a crate was completely filled, the lid short copper nails that would not produce a dangerous spark, and a heavy layer of hot ray. And a heavy layer of hot red wax was poured over the seam, impressed immediately with the official iron seal of the Council of Ten, to guarantee that the contents could not be tampered with or inspected by foreign spies during the long voyage to the mainland. Markets. 2 armed guards, carrying heavy crossbows and wearing the dark woolen uniforms of the State Maritime Police, took their positions at the bow and stern of each galley, their eyes scanning the surrounding waters for any unauthorized fishing boats or small rowboats that might attempt to approach the cargo vessels under the cover of the morning mist. The oarsmen rowed with a slow, synchronized stroke that minimized the vibration of the hull, the wood of the oars dipping into the salt water with a low, rhythmic plash that was the only sound to break the profound silence of the lagoon. The convoy moved along the deep channels marked by tall oak poles, driven into the mud, bypassing the public trade routes and heading directly toward the fortified warehouses of the Giudecca, where the goods would be stored under lock and key until the international merchants paid their heavy export duties solid silver coin. This meticulous maritime logistics system was the final link in the long chain of production that kept within secrets of Murano, locked within the control of the state, ensuring that from the moment the raw quartz stones were gathered in the mountain rivers to the second the finished luxury glass left the territory of Venice, the absolute authority of the Republic remained completely unbroken and unchallenged. The destination of these heavily guarded maritime convoys was the grand commercial hub, a massive 4-story stone palace at the highest point of the Grand Canal, where the Republic forced all northern European merchants to conduct their business under the unblinking surveillance of state inspectors. The interior courtyard of this vast trading house was a scene of absolute, concentrated commercial energy, filled with the deep, echoing clamour of multiple languages, the dry scraping of heavy cargo crates being dragged across the stone pavement, and the scratch of quill pens on official custom rolls. Here the wealthy merchants from Nuremberg, Frankfurt and Antwerp waited for weeks, solid silver chambers, their purses filled with solid silver thalers, just to get a glimpse of the newly arrived crates from Murano. The regulations imposed by the Venetian Senate were unyielding and severe. No foreign merchant was permitted to step foot on the island of Murano itself, nor were they allowed to communicate directly with any master glassmaker there without a state-appointed interpreter present to monitor every sentence. The sales were conducted through a strict system of public auctions managed by the guild officials, who displayed the delicate Cristallo goblets and the massive polished mirrors on long tables covered in crimson cloth, letting the brilliant morning light from the open courtyard illuminate the absolute purity of the work. The northern traders leaned over the balustrades, their eyes wide with a mixture of envy and admiration as they watched the Venetian scribes calculate the export tariffs, which were adjusted dynamically based on the rarity of the objects and the political relations between Venice and the buyeress home country. The wealth generated within these stone walls was immense, flowing directly into the public treasury to fund the construction of the grand churches and the upkeep of the state navy. Yet the men who actually created these beautiful objects saw only a tiny fraction of this gold. The merchants packed their purchases with a desperate care, wrapping the fragile glass in layers of fine wool and packing them into barrel casks filled with dry oats to protect them during the periladhas journey across the rocky alpine passes on the backs of mules. They kep that if even a single barrel was dropped on the steep mountain paths or intercepted by highwaymen in the dark forests of Germany, the financial loss would be catastrophic. For the price of a single set of Murano wine chalices was equivalent to the annual income of an entire northern village. This vast international trade network, while spreading the fame of the Venetian aesthetic to the ends of the earth, served to reinforce the permanent isolation of the creators, whose masterworks became symbols of an empire's power, while they themselves remained trapped behind the shallow mudflats of the lagoon, working the long night shifts to satisfy a continent's endless desire for luxury. The long and hazardous overland journey of the Murano glass from the fortified warehouses of Venice to the wealthy markets of northern Europe's required a completely different set of logistical skills, shifting the responsibility of protection from the state galleys to the specialized caravans of alpine muleteers who made their living traversing the narrow, rock-strewn passes of the Tyrol. These mountain guides were selected by the mercantile houses not for their speed, but for their intimate knowledge of the changing weather patterns and the stability of the steep trails that clung to the edges of the deep limestone gorgels. The heavy timber barrel casks, which had been packed at the Fondaco dei Tedeschi with layers of protective dry oats and soft sheep's wool, were balanced precisely on either side of the massive pack saddles worn by the sturdy mountain mules, an arrangement that required an absolute equilibrium to ensure that the animal did not lose its footing on the wet slate paths. The caravan moved in a single silent file through the deep valleys, the lead animal wearing a small brass bell whose low, dull clapper was wrapped in leather to dampen the sound and prevent it from alerting the robber barons who occupied the crumbling stone castles overlooking the main river routes. The air grew progressively colder as the trail climbed higher into the clouds, the soft maritime humidity of the Adriatic lagoon being replaced by a biting mountain frost that caused the breath of the men and animals to freeze into white plumes in the early morning air. This drastic change in temperature represented a subtle but deadly threat to the structural integrity of the fragile Cristallo glass inside the barrels. If the cold penetrated too deeply into the packing material, any residual internal stress within the glass structures could be acted by the continuous, rhythmic vibration of the mule's stride, causing the delicate stems of the wine chalices to snap like dry twigs without any outward impact. To mitigate this danger, the muleteers made regular stops at fortified wayside inns along the route, driving the pack animals into the sheltered stone courtyards where the barrels could be checked and the leather straps tightened under the watchful eyes of the caravan master. The men slept on the rough timber floors of the stables, with their hands resting on the handles of their short iron swords, fully aware that the contents of just one of those wooden casks represented a value greater than the total weight of the silver coins carried in their belts. The physical strain of this constant mountain climbing was immense, the narrow path sometimes disintegrating into a mere ledge of loose shale, where a single false step by a tired animal would screaming down into the rocky torrent of the river hundreds of feet below. When the caravan finally cleared the highest ridges of the Brenner Pass and began its long, slow descent toward the wealthy imperial cities of Augsburg and Nuremberg, the men did not celebrate, for they knew that the flat northern plains presented a whole new set of dangers in the form of mercenary bands and complex municipal customs tolls that would demand an absolute expenditure of their remaining gold before the cargo could be safely delivered to its final destinations. The successful arrival of a Venetian caravan in the great market square of Nuremberg was treated as a major administrative and cultural event, drawing the wealthiest patricians, banking agents, and foreign ambassadors to the stone steps of the municipal weighing house. Before the timber transport crates had even been pried open, the northern air was sharp and thick, with the heavy smell of coal smoke and roasting meats, a striking contrast to the clean, salty humidity of the Adriatic lagoon, where the glass had been born months earlier. The local guild master of the Merchants' Council stood over the wooden barrels with a long iron crowbar, carefully splitting the dried pine staves, while an official town clerk dipped his quill into black ink to record the condition of every single item that emerged from the packing material. As the thick layers of protective oats and dry meadow straw were slowly cleared away, a crowd of wealthy spectators pressed forward against the wooden barricades, their faces reflecting a mixture of intense curiosity and deep economic envy as the first clear crystallite of the northern sun were lifted into the pale light of the northern sun. The glass appeared almost miraculous to these people, who were accustomed to the heavy, thick green forest glass produced in the remote valleys of the Black Forest, a utilitarian material that was permanently discoloured by iron impurities and filled with large, unsightly air bubbles. By contrast, the Murano chalices were so thin and light that they seemed to possess no physical weight at all, their long, twisted stems resembling frozen water columns that had been captured in mid-air by a master magician. The local wealthy merchants, carrying heavy leather purses filled with silver imperial coins, did not hesitate to bid exorbitant sums for these objects, viewing them not merely as simple drinking vessels, but as essential instruments of social prestige that would establish their high standing in the imperial court. A single pair of clear glass candlesticks, or a small decorative bowl, with delicate to secure a loan from the fuggery work along the rim, was sufficient to secure a banking houses, or to seal a complex marriage alliance between two rival noble families. Yet, behind this public display of luxury and commercial success, a group of quiet men stood at the outer edge of the square, their eyes fixed not on the beauty of the objects, but on the unique thickness of the glass walls and the specific clarity of the material. These were the owners of the local German furnace operations, who had travelled for days from the deep mountain forests to study the Venetian imports, their minds actively seeking a way to reverse engineer the chemical sea that gave the Cristallo its unmatched transparency. They moved among the tables with a quiet, calculating focus, trying to catch a glimpse of any tiny unvitrified quartz grain, or a specific coloration at the base of the stem that would reveal the nature of the flux used by the island masters. This silent industrial competition was an ongoing, invisible war that followed the glass wherever it was sold across the continent, and pressure that ensured that while Venice continued to reap immense profits from its monopoly, the threat of technological theft behind the caravan routes was always just a single step behind the caravan routes. The intense intellectual pressure to crack the Venetian secret formula reached deep into the remote mountain forests of Bohemia and the low, sandy valleys of Silesia, where local glass masters operated within traditional, wood-fired workshops that had been producing coarse utilitarian vessels for centuries. These regional artisans, working under the heavy patronage of local dukes, who were and wealthy landowning electors, who were tired of sending their family silver across the Alps to Venice, began a series of systematic, dangerous experiments aimed at replicating the pristine clarity of the Cristallo technique. The main obstacle they faced was not a lack of heat or clay, but the inherent chemical limitations of their raw materials. The local river sand they shoveled from the mountain streams was heavily contaminated with iron oxides, which permanently stained glass a dark, muddy green or a dull amber colour that looked crude when compared to the crystal-clear imports from the lagoon. To solve this problem, these northern alchemists and furnace masters began employing deep cover agents, often ruined merchants, wandering friars, or disgruntled former apprentices from the northern Italian plains, who were paid handsomely to smuggles of the raw materials used on Murano out of the Venetian territory. Or, in hidden laboratories built far from the main trade routes, to avoid the prying eyes of Venetian spies, these men spent long, sleepless winter nights analysing the physical properties of the materials, using heavy iron pestles to grind down samples of white quartz pebble and burning various coastal plants to analyse the residue left behind in the ash. They kept their experimental mixtures recorded in private, encrypted journals written in complex alchemical codes, where manganese dioxide was referred to as the Glassmaker S soap due to its unique ability to neutralise the iron tint, and potash derived from the burning of hardwood forests was substituted for the unavailable maritime soda ash of the Mediterranean. The atmosphere within these forest workshops was thick with a desperate, competitive urgency, as a single successful breakthrough in creating a clear, stable glass would instantly transform a poor mountain artisan into a wealthy court councillor with a lifetime monopoly granted by the imperial crown. The masters worked alongside their sons before the roaring beechwood fires, their faces blackened by charcoal, and their lungs worn down by the toxic fumes of lead and arsenic compounds they introduced into the experimental melting pots, in a blind, trial and error search for the perfect mineral flux. This silent, decentralized campaign of industrial espionage was slowly eroding the foundation of the Venetian monopoly from the outside, creating a network of rival furnaces across the heart of Europe that were gradually mastering the behaviour of the fire and the stones, moving closer they kept ite hat every failed batch to the day, when the clear mirrors of Versailles and the delicate chalices of Nuremberg could be produced without a single grain of Venetian sand. The systematic erosion of the Venetian monopoly was not driven solely by the frantic experiments of regional northern forests in the dense forests, but was accelerated by a highly sophisticated, state-sponsored network of industrial espionage coordinated from the Grand Ministry offices of London and Whitehall, under the direct patronage of the English Crown and a newly formed syndicate of wealthy London merchants. The push to develop an independent domestic glass industry had become a matter of vital national interest and maritime pride. The English strategy focused its immense financial resources on a single brilliant individual named George Ravenscroft, a wealthy merchant with deep trade connections across the Mediterranean, who possessed a rare combination of practical business acumen and a deep intellectual curiosity regarding the chemical properties of minerals. Ravenscroft established a highly secretive, experimental glasshouse in the quiet riverside district of Savoy, situated along the dark banks of the Thames, far enough from the crowded centre of the city to avoid immediate public curiosity, but close enough to the docks to easily receive shipments of foreign materials. He understood that simply copying the Venetian method of using maritime soda ash was a dead end for England, as the long shipping routes through the Straits of Gibraltar were constantly threatened by Spanish privateers, and the high import duties imposed by the Republic made the raw Italian materials prohibitively expensive. Instead, Ravenscroft took a completely revolutionary path, turning his attention to the abundant domestic resources of the British Isles and focusing his early experiments on the use of chalk cliffs flints, gathered high purities of Kent from the chalk, which he calcined in high heat ovens until they crumbled into a pristine iron-free white powder. To fuse this difficult silica without the Mediterranean soda, he began introducing high proportions of lead oxide into his experimental clay crucibles, a radical chemical departure that completely altered the molecular structure of the molten mass. The initial results of these English experiments were a series of devastating, heartbreaking failures that nearly bankrupted the syndicate. Kistigid the Simpete, the early lead-formulated glass, suffered from a severe structural defect known to the trade as crizzling, a slow internal decay where the clear surface of the vessels would spontaneously develop a microscopic web of turning the beautiful objects into a clouding, brittle substance that resembled decaying river ice. The air inside the Savoy workshop was thick with a heavy, anxious silence during those long winter months of Motnin Saucham Bami II, as Ravenscroft and his trusted Italian assistants, men who had been smuggled out of the lagoon at the risk of their lives, paced before the roaring coal-fired furnaces, adjusting the exact balance of the lead potash and monitoring the cooling vaults with a desperate mathematical precision. They worked in 12-hour shifts under the light of grease lamps, their clothes permanently smelling of sulphur and heavy mineral dust, knowing that the French court had already succeeded in casting mirrors and that the English crown would withdraw its financial backing. If a stable, market-ready crystal could not be produced before the spring shipping season. The breakthrough in the quiet riverside district of Savoy arrived during the damp, foggy weeks of late autumn, when George Ravenscroft finally mastered the precise chemical equilibrium required to stabilize the heavy lead formulation, a discovery that would forever alter the balance of industrial power across the European continent. By meticulously reducing the proportion of potassium carbonate and increasing the purity of the lead monoxide to exactly 30% of the total batch weight, he created a material that was entirely immune to the devastating crizzling disease that had ruined their previous investments. Somewhere, this new English flint glass was a radical departure from the traditional thinner Cristallo. While the Italian material was valued for its paper-thin lightness and its brittle, icy rigidity, the new lead crystal possessed an extraordinary physical density and a deep oily weight that made a single wine chalice feel substantial and solid in a man's hand. The optical properties of this heavy material were completely unprecedented, as the high refractive index of the lead molecules caused the incoming light to bend and scatter with a brilliant diamond-like fire that far surpassed the soft, watery transparency of the Murano work. When the first successful production run was drawn from the coal-fired furnaces of the Savoy glasshouse, the assistant stood in absolute silence as the master cutter brought a finished iron wheel, carving deep geometric facets into the thick walls of the vessel. Instead of fracturing under the intense friction, the lead glass responded beautifully to the tool, its polished edges catching the dim light of the workshop lamps and breaking it into a spectacular spectrum of brick walls that danced across the soot-stained brick walls. Ravenscroft immediately secured an exclusive 7-year patent from King Charles High, which allowed his syndicate to stamp every finished piece with the private mark of a ravenous head, an official seal of quality that quickly became a symbol of supreme luxury among the wealthy elite of London. The English merchants wasted no time in exploiting this technological victory, establishing a network of massive, coal-burning glasshouses along the shipping channels of the Thames and the coalfields of Newcastle and the utilizing the country's vast domestic fuel reserves to produce high-end tableware at a volume and a lower cost that the wood-dependent workshops of Venice could never hope to match. This transformation marked the true dawn of a new industrial era, where the ancient secretive monopoly of the Adriatic lagoon was systematically crushed, not by simple imitation, but by an entirely new science of mineral manipulation born in the dark smoke of the English industrial landscape. The commercial shockwave from the rise of English lead crystal and French cast mirrors hit the maritime capital of Venice during a period of deepening economic stagnation, forcing the Signoria to realize that their centuries-old monopoly had not merely been dented, but was being systematically dismantled by a new generation of coal-fired Waldbau, where state-subsidized foreign industries. The volume of orders at the Fondaco dei Tedeschi plummeted by more than half within a few short seasons, leaving the long stone warehouses along the Grand Canal filled with unsold crates of Cristallo goblets and decorative glass mirrors that were slowly gathering dust. The wealthy patricians who had invested their family fortunes in the Murano furnaces watched with growing alarm as their profit margins evaporated, their private ledgers showing a steady, devastating hemorrhage of silver coin toward the northern capitals. In a desperate bid to save the island's dying trade, the state authorities relaxed some of the ancient, rigid regulations of more flamboyant, allowing the masters to experiment with more flamboyant, theatrical designs in a frantic effort to distinguish their work from the heavy geometric cuts of the English flint glass. It was during this twilight era of the Venetian monopoly that the Murano workshops gave birth to the Ciocca style. Extraordinary, massive glass chandeliers that resembled delicate, frozen gardens suspended in mid-air, composed of hundreds of individually blown translucent flowers and twisting crystal tendrils curved around a central metal core. These structural marvels were designed specifically to illuminate the grand, echoing ballrooms of the late Baroque palaces, their complex, fragmented shapes catching the flickering light of hundreds of wax candles, and scattering the warmth across the frescoed ceilings in a way that no heavy northern lead glass could replicate. The glassmakers worked with a feverish, almost frantic energy before the roaring brick ovens, their blowing irons, spinning the molten material into increasingly thin, twisted threads of milk-white Latimo glass and delicate gold aventurine spangles. They were no longer fighting merely for the artistic glory of their craft, but for the very survival of their families and the preservation of a way of life that had defined the small island for 500 years. The air of Murano during those tense years was thick with the bittersweet aroma of burning pine and the low, continuous murmur of anxious calculations as the older masters stood over the cooling vaults, watching the younger generation struggle to adapt their ancient, intuitive touch to a rapidly changing world that no longer respected the absolute secrets of the lagoon. The emergence of the elaborate Ciocca chandeliers brought a temporary glittering renaissance to the island of Murano, transforming the ancient furnaces into producers of massive, floating architectural sculptures that became the ultimate status symbol for the aging aristocracy of southern Europe. These grand light fixtures, sometimes measuring over 10 feet in height and weighing hundreds of pounds, required an extraordinary level of structural engineering that tested the physical limits of both the material and the men who shaped it. The construction of a single chandelier began not at the furnace mouth, but on the wide stone floor of the design loft, where the master artisan drew a full-scale charcoal blueprint detailing the complex skeletal framework of interlocking iron rods that would support the immense weight of the glass components. Below, on the melting floors, the rhythm of the workshop shifted entirely toward the specialized wispy-stopsies, tiny clear cups to hold the wax candles. In individual courts long twisting scrolls of natural vines, and dozens of delicate translucent blossoms tinted ver kep ite, hat pale rose, soft amber, and deep cobalt blue. The glassmakers worked in perfectly synchronized teams of 3, their movements resembling a complex, silent choreography as they spun the blowing irons to flatten the hot material before using small, pointed tweezers to pull and crimp the edges of each petal while the glass was still in its plastic state. This frantic artistic expansion took place under the heavy shadow of a changing workforce as the older generation of masters, men who had guarded the secrets of the Cristallo with a fierce, absolute loyalty, began to pass away, leaving the furnaces in the hands of a younger generation that felt the heavy weight of their isolation with an increasing sense of resentment, with increasing sense of Zoriza. The strict laws of the Council of 10 remained, written on the official parchment rolls. Yet the state's ability to enforce the total locked isolation of the island was crumbling along with its naval power, as young apprentice regularly slipped away across the shallow mudflats during the dark winter nights. Meal carrying small vials of specialized mineral mixtures and years of practical observations to the rival glasshouses operating in Austria and Spain. The small taverns along the Murano canals, which had once been filled with the proud, boastful songs of wealthy artisans, were now quiet spaces where men sat over cheap red wine, discussing the latest closures of the neighborhood workshops and the steady decline in the price of raw soda ash. The brilliant candle-lit chandeliers that left the island docks for the palaces of Madrid and Vienna were magnificent monuments to a dying empire, reflecting in their hundreds of delicate faceted leaves the slow beautiful sunset of a monopoly that had once ruled the luxury trade of the world. The final assembly and structural testing of a grand Chiocca chandelier was an administrative and technical operation of absolute precision, taking place within the highest hall of the inspection house, where the ceiling timber beams had been reinforced with heavy iron chains to support the immense, concentrated weight of the glass masterpiece before it was allowed to be disassembled for overseas transit. The room was draught-free and dark, its tall lancet windows covered with thick wool curtains to exclude the changing daylight, allowing the master assembler to control the environment completely using only a series of small oil lamps positioned at floor level. In the center of this silent space stood the iron skeleton of the chandelier, a massive, central vertical shaft surrounded by concentric rings of tiered metal branches, all forged by the island's specialized blacksmiths to ensure the iron was completely free from internal air pockets that could cause the structure to sag under the weight of the glass. The master assembler, a senior artisan whose hands were steady despite a lifetime spent beside the heat, stood on a high wooden scaffold, his leather apron filled with small copper pins, lead washers, and fine wire made of soft Venetian brass. One by one, the individual glass components were brought up to him by a chain of apprentices who moved with an absolute fluidness of motion, their bare feet making no sound on the smooth stone floor. The master began from the lowest tier, carefully sliding the hollow ribbed sleeves of clear Cristallo glass over the dark iron branches, ensuring that each glass element fitted snugly lead washer, placed between them to absorb the metal's expansion and prevent any direct stone on stone friction and prevent any aliabarext friction that would cause an instant catastrophic fracture. Next came the delicate ornamental foliage, hundreds of individual blown glass leaves, ver kep hiter hat crimped edges and twisting gold aventurine tendrils, each one hooked onto the tiny iron eyes of the frame using the brass wire, which the master twisted and snipped with a pair of short iron pliers. The ambient silence of the room was punctuated only by the sharp metallic snip of the pliers, and the incredibly delicate, musical tinkling of the glass elements as they brushed against one another in the still air, a sound that resembled a freezing winter rain falling on a forest of ice. The complexity of the arrangement increased as the master worked his way up toward the central crown of the structure, adding tiers of large, hand-shaped translucent lilies and hanging pendants of multicolored glass that were calibrated to balance the weight perfectly across the entire diameter of the frame. If one side of the chandelier was found to be even a fraction of an ounce heavier than the other, the entire structure would hang at a slight angle, placing an unequal and dangerous strain that could cause the entire work to collapse when installed in a distant palace ballroom. To verify the absolute balance and optical perfection of the piece, the master descended from the scaffold and ordered the apprentices to light 50 small beeswax candles that had been placed into the clear beer glass cups along the outer branches. As the tiny flames caught hold, the dark room was instantly transformed into a dazzling, breathtaking matrix of refracted light, the brilliant gold and silver rays bending through the thousands of faceted glass surfaces and casting a swirling, living pattern of shadow and illumination across the stone walls. The master stood at the edge of the light. His eyes narrowed as he inspected the field of illumination for any dull spots or irregular shadows, or a pocket of impure glass. His mind measuring the absolute harmony of the creation against the rigorous standards of an ancient guild, against the industrial machine of the northern kingdoms. Because the terrible coldness that began to settle over the island of Murano during the winter of Motim Baitamihai was not merely a consequence of the freezing winds the Adriatic seas blowing across the Adriatic Sea, but represented a profound systemic death of the economic fires that had sustained the community for centuries. One by one, the great furnace archways along the Rio dei Vetri, the historic canal of the Glassmakers, were allowed to grow dark and cold, their brick interiors cracking as the intense heat that had kept them alive for generations was systematically withdrawn. This widespread shutdown was driven by an unyielding combination of structural factors. The price of imported fuel had risen to an impossible level, because the surrounding mainland forests had been completely stripped of timber to feed the state shipyards, and the international demand for traditional Venetian Cristallo had evaporated into a mere trickle. The grand families of the glass oligarchy, whose private names had once been written in the Golden Book of the Republic, found themselves trapped in a state of genteel ruin, their vast stone palazzi falling into decay, while their private ledgers recorded nothing and cancelled orders from their former northern distributors. The masters and apprentices did not leave the island immediately, for the ancient laws of the Council of Ten technically remained in force, threatening death to any artisan who attempted to carry his skills outside the territory. But the state no longer possessed the resources to pay the monthly retaining subsidies that had historically kept the workforce fed during times of trade stagnation. Men who had spent their entire lives commanding the behavior of boiling minerals and shaping the most exquisite luxury objects on earth now stood in long, or silent lines outside the parish churches of San Donato and San Pietro to receive a single bowl of thin watery soup paid for by the charity of the local bishop. The atmosphere inside the silent workshops was thick with a heavy dust-covered melancholy. The long iron-blowing pipes sat rusting in the corner racks. The smooth marble casting plates were covered in a film of Grey River soot, and the specialized clay pots, which required months of patient seasoning before they could hold the boiling glass mass, sat empty and cracked like ancient sarcophagi. The older masters would sometimes gather inside these abandoned spaces during the late afternoon, sitting on the cold stone bench in 12-hour shifts, where they had once laboured in 12-hour shifts, their burnt and scarred hands tucked deep into the sleeves of their ragged wool coats. To hide the trembling that had settled into their joints, they spoke in low, nostalgic whispers about the great production runs of the past, recalling the exact coloration of the gold created for the Ottoman court, or the absolute transparency of the mirrors they had for the palaces ground, for the palaces of the French king, their words serving as a funeral oration for a collective artistic identity that was being buried alive under the weight of an industrial age that had left them behind. The rhythmic, reassuring sound of the iron shears cutting through molten glass and the steady roaring of the wood fires, which had served as the heartbeat of the island for 500 years, was replaced by a profound, terrifying silence that was broken only by the rhythmic lapping of the dark canal water against the moss-covered steps of the wharf. The definitive death blow to the ancient administrative structure of Murano arrived in the spring of Mortneen Bay, not through the gradual shifting of market forces or the quiet industrial espionage of northern rivals, but through the thunderous arrival of the French revolutionary armies under the direct command of General Napoleon Bonaparte. The 1,000-year-old Republic of Venice, crippled by centuries of indigay and naval stagnation, collapsed within a matter of days, without firing a single defensive shot. The secluded defensive shot, its Grand Council voting to dissolve the state and surrender the sovereign independence of the lagoon to the foreign conquerors. The immediate consequence of this political cataclysm was the total and instantaneous dissolution of the Council of Ten and the structural dismantling of the Glassmakers Guild, an event that shattered the legal fortress that had kept the secrets of the Cristallo locked within the perimeter of the island for 5 centuries. French infantry units, wearing mud-stained blue coats and carrying heavy flintlock muskets, marched through the narrow stone lanes of Murano, their heavy leather boots echoing off the walls of the silent palazzi, while their officers systematically requisitioned the state archives, prying open the iron-bound chests of the guild to inventory the historical properties of the trade. The ancient penal codes, which had once condemned deserting artisans to the gallows or the dagger of a state assassin, were publicly burned in the middle of the island-s market square, the dry parchment sheets crumbling into black ash, amid the cheers of a desperate, hungry population that viewed the arrival of the foreign troops as a liberation from a centuries-old system of industrial imprisonment. However, this political freedom brought no immediate economic relief, for the French administration viewed Venice not as a territory to be developed, but as a rich prize of war to be systematically stripped of its remaining wealth, to fund their military campaigns across the continent. Soldiers entered the abandoned glass houses along the canals, smashing the remaining clay crucibles, and using the long iron-blowing pipes as crowbars to rip down the decorative bronze fittings and structural lead weights from the furnace chimneys, which were melted down on site into ammunition buttons and grape shot. The older masters stood on the opposite banks of the canals, watching in silent, dry-eyed horror as the physical framework of their life labour was broken apart and loaded onto heavy military transport barges, the fragments of historic glass shattering under the heels of the foreign troops with a sharp iron ring that sounded like the final cracking of the island's heart. Many of the remaining artisans, realizing that the unique world that had sustained their families for generations had passed away forever into history, gathered their few personal belongings and their small sets of brass weights to slipping away from the lagoon on neutral merchant vessels. In the rising glass centres of France, Belgium, and the Americas, while those who remained behind simply buried their secret journals in the garden earth and prepared to die in poverty alongside the cold, soot-stained ruins of the grand ovens. The long winter of total industrial oblivion extended deep into the middle decades of the 19th century, leaving the island of Murano a scarred and desolate landscape where the crumbling brick chimneys of the grand glass houses stood like hollow monoliths over stagnant, weed-choked canals. The historic population of master craftsmen had dwindled to a mere handful of elderly men who eked out a miserable living producing crude utilitarian bottles, oil lamps, and cheap, multicoloured glass beads for the colonial trade, a humiliating regression for a community that had once dictated the aesthetic standards of the global luxury market. However, the spark of resurrection was lit in the early morning time Salmi by a small, passionate group of Venetians and foreign connoisseurs who recognized that the total extinction of the island's unique artistic heritage would be an irreplaceable loss to human civilization. This revival was spearheaded by Antonio Colleoni, a brilliant local attorney turned archivist, and Abbot Vincenzo Zanetti, a dedicated parish priest who spent years meticulously excavating the forgotten family mists of the island to rescue the few surviving technical manuscripts. The few surviving manuscript and original drawings that had escaped the French plundering. Together, they established the Museo del Vetro, the Museum of Glass, in the ancient palace of the bishops of Torcello, creating fragments of historic Cristallo, delicate filigree vessels, and intricate milk-white Latimo glass could be gathered and studied as blueprints for a new generation of artisans. The intellectual movement found its practical engine in the figure of Francesco Ferro, a visionary entrepreneur who risked his entire personal fortune to rebuild a massive, state-of-the-art furnace operation on the foundations of a ruined 17th century workshop. Ferro understood that to compete in a modern industrial world dominated by cheap machine-made glass, Murano could not simply copy the past. It had to remaster the intuitive relationship with the raw materials while infusing it with contemporary scientific precision. He tracked down the remaining descendants of the old guild families, men who carried the rhythmic muscle memory and the fragmented formulas of their grandfathers in their minds, and brought them back to the fire, providing them with clean raw materials and reliable coal-fueled furnaces. The air of the island was once again filled with the heavy, familiar smell of boiling minerals and the low, reassuring roar of the draft chimneys as the workshops began the slow, agonizing process of reverse engineering their own historical masterpieces. This 19th century Renaissance was not a smooth process, but a series of frustrating trial-and-error campaigns where the artisans struggled for months to replicate the exact watery transparency of the original Cristallo or the complex structural suspension of the Ciocca chandeliers, their hands trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and pride, as they realized they were successfully waking a sleeping giant from its century-long slumber. The contemporary world inside the high-tech, reinforced brick glass houses of modern Murano exists as a strange, beautiful convergence of hyper-precise chemical science and the unbreakable ghosts of an ancient intuitive oral tradition. The roaring fires that illuminate the workspaces are no longer fed by piles of resinous pine logs or smoky Istrian coal, but are driven by a steady, computerized stream of blue natural gas that keeps the massive ceramic crucibles at an absolute, unvarying temperature of 400 degrees Fahrenheit throughout 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Yet, despite the presence of modern ventilation systems, digital heat sensors, and automated safety hoods that protect the workers from the toxic vapors of the past, the core human drama of the craft remains entirely unchanged from the days when the Council of Ten ruled the lagoon with an iron hand. The master artisan of today, wearing modern protective fibre trousers, but holding a traditional balanced iron-blowing pipe that differs very little from the tools used in the 16th century, stands before the open furnace mouth with his face glistening with a thick layer of immediate sweat, his eyes narrowed as he reads the viscosity of the molten mass by its shifting colour alone. He does not rely on digital readouts or printed manual calculations to determine the exact moment the boiling glass is ready for the tool. Instead, he dips the heavy iron rod into the white-hot material and lifts it with a swift circular motion, watching how the glowing ribbon of glass coils around the metal tip like a thread of liquid honey, his mind measuring its resistance against the deep inherited memory that has been passed down to him through 5 generations of furnace masters. The air inside the workshop is a dense rhythmic matrix of sounds, the low continuous industrial hum of the draft fans, the sharp hiss of wet cherry wood blocks carbonizing against the hot surface of a spinning glass sphere, and the soft, musical tinkling of finished pieces cooling slowly within the long annealing tunnels at the rear of the floor. There are no written formulas or secret parchment sheets taped to the clean brick walls, for even in this century of absolute digital transparency, the ultimate secrets of the Cristallo proportions and the exact timing of the manganese neutralization cannot be captured by a computer algorithm or a printed textbook. They must still be felt through the vibration of the turning iron pipe, learned through the sting of stray beads of heat against the skin of the forearm, and passed from heart to heart through the patient. Spoken instructions shared in the quiet his apprentice, Ibidskis, in the quiet intervals between the intensive shifts, the finished luxury chalices, the massive decorative vases with intricate colour filigree, and the spectacular custom-designed chandeliers that leave the island docks today are shipped across the globe on high-speed transport planes, rather than the slow, heavily guarded galleys of the old Republic. Yet they carry within their pristine, unblemished structures the entire historical weight of a community that refused to let its identity be extinguished by time. When the late evening sun begins to sink below the horizon, casting a long blood-red light across the calm water of the Venetian lagoon and illuminating the ancient stone facade of San Donato, the master artisan finishes his final production run, sets his heavy iron instruments into the cooling racks and stands for a quiet moment before the low rest glow of the furnace hearth, fully aware that as long as the fire continues to burn on this isolated shore, the absolute architecture of the Murano secrets will remain alive, unbroken, and forever safe from the cold oblivion of the outside world. This is a work of creative historical narrative, constructed solely for entertainment, relaxation, and educational purposes. While rooted in verified archives, certain scenes and atmospheres have been textually reimagined to provide an immersive auditory experience. This content was developed with the assistance of advanced AI tools and has been meticulously reviewed, verified, and edited by the editorial team at Whispers of Centuries. All rights reserved. Until next time, listen closely to the whispers of the past, because you never know what timeless wisdom might quietly find its way into your night.